So against this backdrop, we find ourselves in an unprecedentedly serious and dangerous situation, and the consequences are to a large extent unpredictable. That is why I have today invited Mr. Luc Devigne to give us an overview of the recent developments and all the issues I have mentioned. And then we will have, as I have already announced, a roughly 50-55 minutes for an exchange of views. Since this is a joint meeting with our SEDE subcommittee, I would like to ask the Secretariat, is any SEDE representative here? If that's not the case, without further ado, I give the floor to Mr. Devigne, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and good morning to you and honourable members of the European Parliament. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting the European External Action Service in his, indeed, as you mentioned, tragic circumstances and the latest escalation steps taken by Russia. We were very pleased to see the European Parliament and your committee, Mr. Chairman, in particular, playing an important role in calling for strong and concrete support to Ukraine and also for robust sanctions against Russia. And you, Mr. Chairman, as well as honourable members Waszczykowski and Galler, have condemned last week the holding of these sham referenda, the subject of our meeting today. First, what did we see in the last few days, in the last week? Last Thursday was marking the 7th month since Russia has started its brutal, unjustified invasion of an independent country, Ukraine. Independence of which it never contested during 31 years, should I add. And it has been 7 months also that Ukraine has been defending itself bravely and successfully. And recently you have seen that it has managed to push back the Russian army and liberating some territories from the Russian occupation. Unfortunately, this has allowed to discover mass graves that we had seen earlier in Bucha, Irpin, Borodyanka, and that we are now seeing in new places like Izium. Thousands of civilians have been murdered, and many more of them have been beaten, tortured, harassed, sexually assaulted, kidnapped, forcibly displaced. Russia will have to be held accountable, as you were mentioning in your introduction, for all the suffering that this war has brought upon the Ukrainian people. Last Friday, the Commission of Inquiry on Ukraine presented their findings to the United Nations Human Rights Council, documenting war crimes committed by Russia in Ukraine. We will do whatever it takes to ensure accountability. We rely, of course, on the International Criminal Court and also on the Ukrainian authorities, and we are supporting both financially and assisting also materially the Office of the Ukrainian Prosecutor General on providing training, expertise, equipment, and also collecting evidence. Ukraine has managed to withstand the aggression by Russia, and it's been possible thanks to the bravery of Ukrainian people, but also it's been possible through the support, political, financial, and military, that the European Union and its like-minded partners have granted to Ukraine. Considering the absence of military successes, President Putin is now continuing along a very sad path of escalation and is trying to not only intimidate Ukraine, but also all the countries that support Ukraine. Russia has announced it was mobilizing hundreds of thousands of new conscripts, although it was claiming officially that it only had lost 6,000 soldiers. So there's a bit of a contradiction here. And according to official announcement, mobilization would apply to 300,000 reservists. However, parts of the decree remain secret, and we don't know what the exact numbers will be. At the same time, Minister of Defense Shoigu stated that there were almost 25 million such men in Russia, which of course seems exaggerated. But nevertheless, talking of partial mobilization may be actually some form of propaganda to reassure the people that the problems are much bigger than what it is officially acknowledged. Secondly, Russia is now conducting these sham referenda in Donetsk, Lugansk, Kherson and Zaporizhia regions, even if it's far from militarily controlling all of them, trying to repeat the well-known 2014 Crimea scenario. And thirdly, and this is to be read in conjunction with the previous point, Russia has been also threatening again with the use of weapons of mass destruction against Ukraine, and using even the platform of the United Nations General Assembly last week, where world leaders were assembling. I should add that the only good news of last week was the prisoners' exchange, 215 Ukrainians versus 55 Russians, but unfortunately more than 2,000 Ukrainians remain prisoners as well. Now, what has been the European Union reaction to these latest escalatory steps? You have seen the very quick and very firm statements by the High Representative, by EU27, by G7 leaders, and we have also coordinated our reaction with our partners and allies. Our message is triple. One, we will not recognize those sham referenda, and obviously not their results. Secondly, we are actively examining new restrictive measures in reaction to this escalation. And thirdly, any reference to nuclear weapons or threats against nuclear power plants, which Russia is cynically bombarding, are pushing Russia to the margins of civilized nations. High Representative condemned this as an irresponsible and cynical attempt to undermine our steadfast support to Ukraine. But the Russian threats do not shake our determination, resolve and unity to stand by Ukraine as long as it will take. We have been clear that those who are involved with these so-called referenda will be held accountable, and this will be the subject of also the additional restrictive measures. We have also announced last week in an extraordinary meeting of Foreign Affairs ministers in New York that we would continue or even increase our military support to Ukraine. And we have so far supported military assistance under our European Peace Facility, and we intend to propose a new tranche soon. Also, preparation have intensified to define the parameters for a new EU military assistance mission to Ukraine. Thirdly, the reactions of the Russian society to the ongoing mobilization is quite amazing. We have seen in a few days thousands of Russian citizens taking the streets and protesting despite the very brutal repression and the very serious threats that they risk of being sent to prison or being beaten, etc. More than 2,000 have so far been detained during this protest, but we also have seen many more Russians voting or protesting with their feet by leaving their country. And we have seen the queues at the land borders of Russia with Kazakhstan, with Georgia, with Mongolia, with Azerbaijan, stretching for kilometers and kilometers. We also have observed the skyrocketing prices of flights to leave Russia or their mere unavailability. Fourth, the way ahead. We believe that these escalatory steps show signs of a certain crisis, critical moment at least. First, the Ukrainian army is continuing its counteroffensive, liberating new towns and villages. And we have seen that since the morale in the Russian army is probably very low, President Putin decided to change the legislation by toughening the sentences for surrendering, criminalizing it, or refusal to serve in the army with up to 10 years prison sentence. Secondly, our sanctions, our economic sanctions, do work. Russia is facing its worst recession since the 90s. The GDP is expected to drop by over 11%, which is even bigger than since the collapse of the Soviet Union, the largest drop. Thirdly, internationally, Russia is more and more, even merely diplomatically, but very firmly isolated. And even so-called allies like China, or more recently also India, important partners, have declared that today's era is not an era of war, and clearly also expressing concerns. Turkish President Erdogan also urged to end the war and stated publicly that the lands which were invaded will be returned to Ukraine. At the same time, we see also nationalist circles inside Russia protesting as well. So we believe that for us, for the European Union, this means that our resolve must be as strong as possible and must continue. We have supported Ukraine also through the Black Sea Grain Initiative, facilitated by United Nations Secretary General Guterres and Turkey. We have also developed the so-called solidarity lanes, facilitating exports from Ukraine into the EU. This has also helped the world by lowering global food prices, and contrary to what Russian propaganda would like to pretend, the Russian food prices do not increase because of the sanctions, but because of the war that they are waging. So let me just conclude by saying that, I'm quoting High Representative Borrell, I will say it in French because it was an interview in French, ce n'est pas le moment de faiblir en Ukraine.
Now is not the time to weaken when it comes to Ukraine.
Thank you, Mr. Devigne, for your valuable comments. And now I will open the floor for members. And we begin with Michael Gahler, who's our standing rapporteur on Ukraine.
Thank you very much. I share your description and condemnation. I need not repeat to that. There was this informal foreign ministers meeting in the margins of the United Nations, and you also referred to new restrictive measures incoming. Is that deliberate, yet you do not call it sanctions or only restrictive measures? Will the next October Council formalize it, and can you go into more details what we are aiming at in this respect? On the implementation of the sanctions that have already been agreed, have you got an overview where we stand in this regard? For instance, the coal imports, have they really stopped throughout the EU? Do we already see a substantial reduction of oil imports, which is to be ended, I think, if I'm not mistaken, by the end of the year? Do you see, when we say it's not the moment to get weaker, with the last words of the High Rep, we need to continue, of course, supplying Ukraine with weapons, but I think it also requires that in the member states, the ammunition production has to be substantially increased. Do you see that? Is there a coordination mechanism where you push or look into these realities on the ground in the member states? I'm a bit afraid that at some point we might not be able to step up our support. And what about the discussion of fighter tanks ongoing? Well, of course, especially in Germany, but this discussion, 2,000 Leopard tanks are available in 13 countries. If we get 200 delivered in a coordinated effort, are there activities from your side to encourage such thoughts in different member states? Thank you.
Thank you. I would suggest that we have one round of comments and questions and then hand over to Luc Devigne. The next on my list would be for the EPP, Andreas Kubilius.
Well, thanks a lot for a description of that picture, which is quite worrying. I will not repeat what Michael have said, but my question would be very simple. Since we watched, successful military offensive of Ukrainians recently in Kharkov region, it became very clear that, Ukrainians with our, support of military weapons are able to achieve victory, as soon as possible. And it depends, when the war will end, it depends on how much of weapons we are able to deliver to Ukrainians. And then, of course, we are repeating that we are supporting as EU, but if we are looking into the numbers, I don't know exactly the numbers, but through, peace facility, we are delivering, we are financing around of 2.5 billion, euros for weapons deliveries. It's not very clear how much, member states are doing outside of, peace facility, but it's not very I doubt if those numbers are very big. On another side, Americans, decided much earlier in the year to provide 40 billion support. As I understand now, they are discussing another bill of 12 billion. So the picture is, very clear. Americans are doing the job. We are, on the European continent, we are looking, we are supporting, we are saying solidarity, words and so on, but we are not doing the job. And I agree absolutely with Mikhail. We are not asking our industry, to increase production. So my question is really, when we see that, picture, which is really brings a lot of, worries, and also threats about nuclear and so on, the only way how we can speed up, the end of the war is to deliver weapons. So are we able to reach the level, at least to match to American, or should we, or that is our destiny, to look how Americans are resolving issues on the European continent?
Thank you. Would somebody from the S&D like to take the floor? Please, Mr. Shimoshevich.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Devigne, for your information. However, there are still many issues which deserve to be touched or deepened. It's not very difficult to foresee the events in coming days. This week, this is probably going to be a very special week in modern history. I understand that the results of fake referenda, which have been on the Putin's desk for a long time, are going to be announced. Then we can expect the decision of incorporating those parts of Ukraine to Russia, which is going to be confirmed by two chambers of so-called Russian parliament. And then, of course, they will declare a different narrative that they are going to present Ukraine as an aggressor against Russia, against Russian territory. That will, of course, allow them, in their mind, to use their so-called defense doctrine, including use of nukes. What is our reaction to be if those easily forecasted developments really take place? I'm afraid that condemning that is not sufficient, is not enough. You said, Mr. Devigne, that there is, I understand, mechanisms of studying possible new restrictions or means to use against Russia. However, let me say that last package of sanctions, in my personal opinion, was already symbolical and meaningless. If we continue to act like that, we are risking to be totally ineffective. And what about that possibility of use of nuclear weapons? For the first time, as I understand, Mr. President Zelensky said that Putin is not bluffing. Usually, he tried to downplay the risks. Today, he says that. If that happens, what will be the EU reaction? I understand that United States and UK are especially responsible as co-signers of Budapest Memorandum. But are there any consultations between us and them, or are we just waiting for the developments of the situation? What about Russian conscripts or potential conscripts trying to leave this country? Many member states decided not to accept them, not to allow them. In my opinion, it's a mistake. Everything that weakens Putin and Russia's army should be understood as something positive. Not forever, not as asylum seekers, but just for the time when they are endangered. This is two ways to eliminate those people as our enemies. Either to equip Ukrainians to kill them in the battle or to let them to come to our countries. We will not have them in the front of this war. So are we able, as the European Union, considering Orban's position and policy, considering the results of elections in Sweden and Italy, to adopt a strong common position and reaction to all those potentially very, very dangerous developments in Ukraine? Thank you.
Thank you. Just to inform you, we have in the moment 6 more colleagues who would like to take the floor. Can you please raise your hands now? We have natural. 7. Do you want to do 2 rounds or Sergei, Viola? I think everyone in the room has now requested to take the floor. Mr. Devigne, would you like to do 1 or 2 rounds?
No, I will do it now.
Okay, well, let's have at least one more group take the floor now. Mr. Bütikofer.
Thank you, Chair. Thank you, Mr. Devigne, for your valuable remarks. Indeed, as the Chair said in the beginning, we are facing an unprecedented situation, and the development of events is indeed unpredictable. But at the same time, we should and must be firm in our determination to indeed support Ukraine actively as long as it takes on all fronts. And I agree with Mr. Kubilius that in this situation, we have to increase that support in all the different dimensions. By the way, just one side remark regarding China. I'm not sure that China is unhappy or is concerned with the fact that Putin is waging war. I'm rather of the opinion that China is unhappy that he's not winning the war. That's how I read their position. As regards the different dimensions of this fight and our contribution to that, number one should be, and I can only reiterate what Michael Gahler said, we have to make sure that the sanctions that are in place are indeed enforced. And we must also demand from the member states' governments that they should see to it that these sanctions are enforced. Second, as we see the sanctions, the present level of sanctions is already having an impact in Russia. And I would support further sanctions, but I'm not sure that increasing the level of sanctions will have a decisive effect. Because Putin is not motivated by economic rationale. He's motivated by imperialist thinking. And he's willing to sacrifice his economy if he needs to pursue his goal of making Russia great again. That's why I would rather emphasize other fronts. I think we have to increase our military support. It's long past time that member states start providing modern battle tanks to Ukraine. I also believe that we have to work on the diplomatic front. Through his continuous breach of international law, and through his threats with using weapons of mass destruction, Putin is even more becoming a pariah internationally, and we should make clear that this is also pursued by our diplomatic services and in the realm of our own public opinion. Those are two very important fronts. Thank you.
Thank you. To conclude this first round, Mr. Botenga.
Yes, thank you very much. Let me we speak about this escalation of the annexation, illegal referenda, the threat with nuclear war and partial mobilization. The question, of course, for us, and I think what the colleague said is true, is how to de-escalate, how to avoid indeed what now Zelensky calls no bluff. Meaning the threat with nuclear weapons, be it then strategic nuclear weapons whatsoever, that does not become a reality. Now, the impression I got from other countries' reactions China, India, and so on, is that not only they're not happy with this, they'll actually, for the moment, they were not, let's say, supporting EU sanctions, supporting the EU approach, but insisting very much on diplomacy. So my question is here, is the European Union, are we considering that these military, let's say, defeats or at least setbacks for Russia, the fact that internationally some of, let's say, the countries that have not taken a stance other than a neutral stance are not happy with what's going on, does that offer a window for diplomacy? Does it offer a window for another way of de-escalation? Because sanctions, as we have seen, aside from the harm they are clearly doing to the Russian economy, they did not prevent war, they will not stop war. Is there any way where you say, how are we going to de-escalate, to avoid, for example, that this threat of short-term or medium-term use of nuclear weapons becomes a reality? Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Botenga. Back to you, Mr. Devigne. And please bear in mind we have a second round waiting.
Yes. Thank you, honourable members, for these quite challenging questions. Some of them I can answer, some more difficult, and some I frankly cannot in a public meeting. That's also a reality. Mr. Gahler, why sanction, why restrictive measures? It's just the legal terminology that we have, but actually we do mean, of course, sanctions. We never disclose in advance, of course, the detail of economic sanctions or of individual listings for obvious reasons, to avoid preventive circumvention, to avoid speculation on certain goods that might become more expensive or unavailable, that kind of things. But the work is ongoing. There will be new export bans, new import bans, new sectors. Some sectors will be extended, etc., and new listings of companies and individuals will be published. On coal, the import by the EU is sanctioned since August. The question remains now for the shipments to third countries, but inside the EU it's already sanctioned. European companies are not allowed to participate in shipments of coal, of Russian coal, to third countries. And we are discussing currently with the Commission and the Member States on these matters. Weapons, ammunition, do we coordinate? Yes, but again, I do not want to give any details in public on this type of matters. Mr. Gubelius, I must say that, well, we can, of course, always hope for more production of weapons or ammunition of both, but this is a member state's competence. It's complete. Sorry. We can hope and encourage if you want. But this is obviously not an EU competence. Again, the steps that we have taken with the war in Ukraine are unprecedented. If you look at what has been achieved, of course, it's like the proverbial glass, half full, half empty. You can always hope for more. I do, however, beg to disagree with you when you say US are doing the job. No, because the economic sanctions and the economic bit, which is important because it is crippling also the war machine of Russia, the vast bulk is the EU. It's the EU only. It's not the US. Mr. Simosiewicz, pardon for the pronunciation, my colleague can correct. Cimosiewicz, okay. The result of the referendum are known in advance, of course, yes. As I said, this is a scenario a la Crimea. Since 2014, Crimea, from the Russian point of view, is Russia. Of course, we completely do not recognize this at all. But I would like to say that also since the beginning of the war, Ukraine has already also done military strikes in Crimea. So there is no need to go, I think, into further rhetoric escalation on these nuclear threats. I know that there are discussions also bilaterally between also nuclear powers on these matters. On the questions of Russian conscripts fleeing their country, well, you have 2 points of view. Some say that the more leave, the less will be available for the army. It's obvious. Others say that it's a security matter because it's not because they leave that they're against the war or even an opponent to the government. And if you start, you cannot equate automatically, certainly not legally speaking, somebody avoiding military conscription with political refugee because it doesn't transform into an opponent. So these are discussed with the member states. We discussed that yesterday, and we're trying indeed to have a coordinated approach, but it's not that simple because the EU legislation, Schengen Code, does allow for either revocation of existing visas or not allowing entrance for visa holders for security reasons, Article 6 of Schengen Code, which is our legislation. Mr. Bouki, is China happy and happy? We can speculate. I believe China is not happy with the adventurism of Russia because what was presented as a small special military operation that would last a couple of hours or a couple of days is now never-ending. Prices of energy, which China is the world's largest importer, are increasing. Even if they have some discounts or that there are rumors of some discount, nevertheless it's increasing. It's a problem for their exports because most of their exports are far away, so energy prices is a problem for Chinese exports. It risks creating a recession in their markets, in their destination. This is not good for them. Food prices increase. They are the world net importers of food as well, largest net importer of food as well. So there are a number of things. And if I read what was said in Shanghai Cooperation Organization, if I also read, by the way, what traditional allies of Russia like Kazakhstan have said that they would not recognize these illegal annexations and referendum, etc., I think that there is indeed a more and more certain diplomatic isolation of Russia. And yes, we're working a lot on that. We're also working on the battle of narrative because Russian propaganda wants to portray us as the cause for the problems in the world. Mr. Botenga, how to de-escalate? It's a very good question. We already avoid to escalate ourselves. But, you know, the proverb, it takes two to tango or two to make peace and only one to make war. And we believe that making the price of the war more expensive for Russia is part of the escalation, even if it's not a magic wand. Yes, I agree with you that economic consideration and certainly the well-being of his people is not driving Russian leadership. But nevertheless, I think it's our duty to continue the way we do. Thank you.
Thank you. We come to our second and final round, and I would like to ask colleagues to try and stick to 2 minutes. And the first is Francisco Milan Mon.
Gracias, Presidente.
Thank you, Chair. And thank you to Mr. Devigne for the information you've given us and for your comments thereafter. I'd like to refer to a point that was raised by Mr. Butikofer. For me, it's very important, and you mentioned this, that the EAS and the EU communicate our position efficiently. This is about the narrative war. We need to make it so that the majority of 140 countries which condemned the invasion on the General Assembly be visible. It shouldn't look as though things are balanced. This needs to be translated into facts. There's a lot of ambiguity in the position of other countries. We, the EU, US, the like-minded countries, Australia and Japan, and other ones, and Morocco didn't vote, neither did Algeria, Brazil looked the other way, etc. Turkey, well, is a member of NATO, but we also know how ambiguously they are acting. I think that this raises some eyebrows. Lavrov has been very active on the diplomatic front. Remember that a few months ago, the African Union was asking for a lifting of sanctions. There's been a lot of work with Kazakhstan, etc. What are we doing? Now, I don't know what Mr. Michel has been doing. I think he was there in New York, and he often goes to Africa. What did he do in New York? Tell us. I don't know what he did. Ms. von der Leyen, I think, has been less present externally because it's Mr. Borrell's job and Mr. Michel's job. But in terms of sanctions, trade, she does have competences. Therefore, I think that Mr. Borrell, Mr. Michel, and Ms. von der Leyen have to be active internationally out there. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is our colleague Heine Luoma, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to continue the discussion on those people who are fleeing Russia, those young men who are not ready to go to army and who are not ready to go to Ukraine to kill Ukrainians. So, and this is obviously it's a competence of the Commission because we have the Schengen area. And I have to say that this is a little bit embarrassing that at the same time we see that the President of the Council, Mr. Michel, is saying that these young men are welcome to European Union, or they ought to be welcome to European Union. And at the same time, there are more and more member states who are closing their borders for these young men. So, and this is a question which is an urgent one, because it's an acute question that these people are coming now. And then we know also that Mr. Putin and the government of Russia is thinking to close their borders so that these young men could not have the possibility to go abroad and flee the military service. So I just would like to urge you to do your utmost that the Commission, who is a key player in the how the Schengen rules ought to be executed, would create an atmosphere that we would have a united front. This is embarrassing for our people, especially in these countries who are near the Russian border.
Thank you. Next is Sergej Lagodinsky.
Thank you very much. Thanks for your information. A couple of points. One point is the future of sanctions, or how is our confrontation or defense of Ukraine, support for Ukraine, is going to look like past sanctions. Because I think we are coming in a situation where sanctions have been exhausted. And the question to you is, what are going to be the main instruments, the main leverage that we will be having? How we're going to be going about that? This is number one. Number two, personal sanctions. Part of the package probably would be personal sanctions. In which direction would you go? Will the 6,000 people list prepared by our allies from the civil society of Russia be a foundation, or what are the next steps? Propagandists. One of our proposals is to sanction those who are members of the Duma parties on all levels and enjoy and have offices, also on municipal level, to, for example, ban them from entry to the European Union. This would be a real way of differentiating on the border. Number two, hybrid dimension of escalation that is upcoming. And it's not just about propaganda. It's about security concerns. It's about possible sleepers or who are either here or are coming. What is the Commission and what are member states, maybe you have information on that, and your services is doing to strategically think about the next steps of this escalation that would be not just economic, they would be hybrid in terms of our security threat. And the last point, and I will end with them, legally speaking, you said on the border, there is no right of those people to enter the European Union. You are talking about Schengen. It's not about Schengen. It's about our asylum seekers and the corridors for people to apply for asylum. And even though we can be of different opinions on how to deal with them in terms of welcoming that on a large scale, there must be, just as in the Mediterranean, an opportunity for people to apply for asylum at the border of the European Union. This is what doesn't happen now. And this has to be addressed. So was this addressed during yesterday's meetings, and what are you planning to do to combat this risk?
Thank you. Colleague Jordanov is next.
Szanowny panie dyrektorze, oczywiście będzie mówił na język polski.
Thank you. I'm going to speak Polish, Mr. Director. Thank you for the information that you've provided us with. I have two questions. The first question relates to security when it comes to the workers in the Zaporozhye nuclear plant. My question relates to the protection of that nuclear power plant by international forces. Exceptional situations call for exceptional solutions, and the war in Ukraine is such an exceptional situation. An accident in the Chernobyl vein would be a global catastrophe. Secondly, what is being done at present when it comes to better informing EU citizens about the situation where we have a war in Europe that they can't expect to go on living as before the war. The people in Europe have to be prepared to the difficult times ahead. Thank you.
Thank you. Next is Nacho Sanchez Amor.
I'm speaking Spanish. Gracias.
Thank you, Chair. I won't be repeating what colleagues have said. There's this possibility that Russia might consider itself to be attacked after the sham referenda. But there's something I want to talk about. There's going to be another vote at the UN level. And once again, we're going to have a map of the disappearance of countries that are really involved. We'll see how many of them are lukewarm. We're at a point where we want to keep our countries, but our friends, but we have to. Our friends need to make it clear that they are not like the lukewarm countries or like those who have disappeared from this map. This is going to be our map and our compass for foreign policy in the months to come. We have to see which countries are absent and which actually support votes against Russia. So that's what we need to be looking at. And Turkey has had a very ambivalent role. We all know this. Publicly, and the UN President Erdogan has used his position as a mediator, which he's very happy to have at a domestic level as well. And I know that Turkey has been receiving messages from Parliament and from the EAS. They've been told not to play with sanctions because some activities of Turkey are borderline support to Russia with regards to sanctions, so we should keep our pressure. It needs to stay on. The role so far of Turkey has been positive, but they cannot use it as an excuse to carry out policies that are very close to supporting Russia.
Thank you. Next is Viola von Kramon.
Thank you, Chair, and thanks to Mr. Devigne for the information. First of all, I can only stress what you have said regarding China. I think it was remarkable that she, after 2.5 years of not traveling, the first destination he has chosen was Kazakhstan, who is openly an opponent of Mr. Putin and who is sat, though, in Petersburg and now at the Samarkand summit as well. And also, I mean, the whole pictures which were sent globally during this summit in Samarkand, I think, have mainly shown that even the worst dictators in the world are rather ready to isolate Putin there. And I think there was a remarkable situation. Second of all, regarding food prices, I mean, one has to keep in mind that China is buying each and every ton of grain on the world market. Are you somehow in contact with them? Because they are completely separated from the global food prices. They keep the storages extremely high. That seems to be an interesting strategic reserve. And China, Indonesia, and India together, decrease the global storages in a way which, of course, affects the exports from Russia and Ukraine even more. And it would be extremely important to have a better outreach to China and India in that respect. And regarding the security, I can only support what Sergei has said. I think it is important to have a proper asylum procedure, because there are a lot of indications now that even I was very much sympathetic with opening the borders for those young men who do not want to serve in Ukraine. But there will be a lot of FSB agents amongst them, and this creates a huge security risk for all of us. I mean, I know it's a dilemma, and I have a lot of sympathy to invite them, but not just like this.
Thank you. Our final two speakers are David Lega and Andrzej Halicki, and then we need to close the speakers just because I know that group meetings begin at 9 o'clock. So, David.
Thank you, Chair, and thank you, Mr. Devigne, for taking the time to have this exchange with us in these very troubling times indeed. I want to start by reiterating my colleagues' remarks regarding the need for increased support for Ukraine, but also I wanted to support you in your initial interventions regarding the distancing that we see from both China and other countries right now, India, even though I personally am a bit skeptical regarding the seriousness of China's distancing and their true intentions. But I wanted to come back to Russia's friends instead right now. We see the increased cooperation with Iran. Luckily, the drones that they are buying aren't of a good quality, but your thoughts regarding Russia's friends, the increased cooperations with Iran, and how can we make sure to do our best to prevent Russia having more friends? And what are you doing in that perspective? Thank you.
Thank you, David. And finally, Andrzej.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. My colleagues from Bulgaria use so good Polish, so I'm obliged also to use my native language. Mam bardzo krótkie pytanie.
I have a very quick question. Now we're talking about the potential conscripts from Russia who want to come to Europe. Do we have any estimates as to how many people we're talking about? I have mixed feelings as far as this issue goes, because I mean, Russian citizens should be held accountable for what's happened. And like Mr. Lagodinsky said, I think we need a broader sanctions package. Family members of the military people, for instance, should be hit. And we have to react more quickly. And what about Belarus? Are we considering sanctions against Belarus? Who's also responsible? Thank you.
And to conclude, Mr. Devigne, I would just like to make one comment which a number of colleagues have already touched upon. I stand by our European humanitarian obligation, which includes granting humanitarian visas to Russian citizens after a case-by-case assessment. But each individual asylum application must be carefully examined. And a blanket promise of asylum for Russian conscientious objectors, in my point of view, would simply be wrong, because every case needs to include a security check. And we have to be blunt, not every conscientious objector is also an opponent of the regime of Mr. Putin. Because a lot of Russian men who are now fleeing the country where they are threatened with their own military service have at least not been actively against this war, perhaps even supporting this war. So I don't believe the theory that every conscientious objector is also an opponent of Mr. Putin. We have to be very careful in our examinations. And the final point is what we definitely need is a coordinated European position on this issue. And what we're seeing here once again is that some national governments are rushing ahead with their own positioning, and once again we're not showing unity. Perhaps can hear some views from you on that point.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I will start by the end. I fully agree with you. Now we live in the legal framework that we have, and certainly asylum procedures. Of course, there's no big discussion that they should be made redundant or that we should create exceptions from the asylum procedure. The asylum procedure is, of course, an individual case, and the security check can take place with it as well as checking the real motivation, which is indeed a completely different attitude than giving blanket exemptions. We do not know the numbers yet. We have seen increase in Finland, serious increase in Finland, which is I think the country in the EU which has so far seen the biggest increase. But there are also rumors that Russians will tighten the control for the exit, which so far has not been the case. Apparently, there are reports that border control posts were kind of conducting very artisanal interviews on a case-by-case basis, but not having listings. And I mean, all seems to have been rushed in a way, ineffectively. There are also reports of bribing to be allowed to leave, etc., etc. So I guess we will see the wave effect in some time. Mr. Alitsky, on the Belarus, I can reassure you there are already sanctions on Belarus. They're a different package, but they are existing. On the question of the diplomatic outreach, believe me, we spent a lot of time doing that, and the High Representative, the first one, and making known that also that the attitude towards this war is not just are you in the West or are you supporting the West? It's also, and first and foremost, are you supporting international law or are you supporting a blatant violation of absolutely all principles ranging from OSCE to United Nations that military conquest or acquisition of territory by military force is illegal. And we spend a lot of time on that. We know in international relations, of course, every country takes its interest into consideration, but there's a price for everything. You were referring to President Michel's speech in United Nations General Assembly. He proposed clearly that a country attacking a sovereign state should be suspended from the United Nations Security Council. So I don't think he can be accused of having ignored the matter. And yes, there are some countries who are ambiguous. We are aware of reports of circumvention of sanctions by Turkey, particularly. Some other countries as well. We are examining this. I'm actually going to Turkey next week. At the same time, Turkey has played a positive role in the Black Sea grain deal, which was quite important both for Ukraine and for the world. And we spent also a great deal of explaining to our African friends that this is not us who are driving the price of food upwards and fighting the Russian propaganda there and blatant lies. On the question of sanctions, first of all, I don't think that economic sanctions will be soon exhausted. I think that there's a lot of leeway. You have also seen that at G7 there are discussions of oil caps, oil price caps, etc. So there's a lot more that you can do. Do not forget that when it comes to individual sanctions, that we are legally bound and that our sanctions are subject to legal review by jurisdiction of the European Court of Justice. and that, for instance, the 6,000 names that I think you were alluding to of the Navalny, compiled by the Navalny group, I think are mainly linked to corruption. But corruption is not the legal criteria for our current regime. It's rather attacking independence, sovereignty of Ukraine. So we have to do this. But we are definitely continuing. We will put individuals that are obviously linked to the recent steps with these referendum, etc. Then on the question of Zaporizhia, but also unfortunately 2 other nuclear power plants which have been attacked by Russia, one Mykolaiv, another one with a longer name. Yes, this is extremely worrying. We've been quite active with the International Atomic Agency to secure as much as we can. When it comes to informing EU citizens, this is unfortunately also very much the responsibility of national governments of what's going on. Traditionally, you know that this is the case for the better or the worse sometimes. Yes, I think I covered it all. And yes, Ms. von Kramon, discussing contact with China, I'm not aware of this. It's probably very important to do. Not sure China would necessarily listen to us if they want to secure as much food as possible for themselves. But we are following that very clearly. We're also following the support by Iran, but you know the state of the relations with Iran is sufficiently complicated already, and it's frankly not so simple to imagine to have some more leverage on Iran on this. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Devigne. This concludes today's meeting. I would like to thank you all for your participation and contributions. Would anyone like to raise something under any other business? That is not the case. Our next meetings will be on the 12th and 13th of October. Timing still to be confirmed. This meeting is closed.